Her husband divorced her for barrenness. A widowed farmer held their twins at dawn. The first thing I did every morning after Nora died was check the fence line along the south pasture. Not because it needed checking, most mornings it didn't, but because if I didn't put my boots on the ground and walk somewhere specific before the sun got above the hills, I'd stand in the kitchen with the coffee going cold and not know what I was doing in the world. That went on for 4 years, maybe 5. After a while, the seasons blurred together the way they do when you're working through them alone. I had 82 acres outside a place called Ridgeton, which was less a town than a collection of decisions men had made and then stuck with past the point of wisdom. Good soil in the bottomland. Decent well. A barn that needed new board-end batten on the east face and had needed it since the spring Nora got sick. I kept telling myself I'd get to it. I kept not getting to it. The farm ran. That I could do. Sorghum, a kitchen garden, 6 head of cattle I didn't name because I'd learned from the first 2 what naming them cost you. The work was there every day and I did it, and that was enough of a life that I didn't examine it too closely. The Hargrove place was 1.5 miles north, up the creek road. Ezra Hargrove had the kind of face that looked like it had been formed with a thumb pressed flat, wide, pale, eyes set too close. He'd come to the territory 8 years ahead of me, had the best claim in the valley, and he talked about that claim the way some men talk about God. Like it was a thing that had chosen him, and that choice said something final about his worth. He had a wife. Cecilia was her name. I'd seen her at the dry goods twice, maybe 3 times over the years. Tall woman, dark-haired, moved like she was being careful not to take up too much room. She had a way of answering questions with fewer words than the question used, which I took for shyness at the time. I understand now it wasn't shyness. It was a woman who'd learned that the less she said, the less there was to be used against her. I heard about the divorce the way you hear most things in Ridgeton. I didn't hear it from anyone directly, I just came to know it. Hargrove had put it about that she was barren. That was his word, the word he chose to use publicly, in a county where the word carried weight like a millstone. 8 years of marriage and no children, and he decided the fault was hers, and said so in terms that no one who heard them forgot. He took another wife inside of 3 months, a girl of maybe 20 from Tucson who'd come up with her uncle's supply wagon. Cecilia got the clothes on her back and a sum of money I was told was small enough to be an insult. She took a room above the feed and grain in Ridgeton. I don't know what she did with herself for the first weeks. I was not paying attention to other people's troubles. I had enough of my own, which is another way of saying I had none at all and was using work as a substitute for feeling anything. What brought her to my door was practical. She'd heard I needed someone to keep the kitchen garden through the summer, that I'd let it go to weeds the year before. Somebody in town had told her I paid fair and didn't ask much of the women who helped with domestic work. That was true. I asked nothing, really. I stayed out of the house when they were in it, did my work outside, left money on the table. 3 women in 4 years had come and gone that way. One moved east with her husband. One got ill. One found better paying work in Tucson. None of them lasted more than a season, and none of them wanted to. Cecilia Hargrove came on a Tuesday in late May. She knocked on the porch post because the door was open, and I was standing at the kitchen table oiling a bridle, and I looked up and said, "Come in," and she came in. She was thinner than I remembered from the dry goods. There were circles under her eyes that hadn't been there, or that I hadn't noticed. She was wearing a gray dress that had been let out and taken in enough times the fabric had the soft, uncertain look of something that had given up remembering its original shape. She told me what she was there for plainly. No elaboration. What she wanted was work. What she offered was hard and reliable. What she would need was a wage and no charity wrapped inside it. I told her what I paid. She said that was acceptable. I told her she could start when she wanted to. She said tomorrow. She left. I went back to the bridal. That was June. By August I had the best kitchen garden I'd had since Nora was alive. She had a way with things growing, a patience with them, a willingness to put her hands in the soil and stay there until the work was done right. The rows were straight. The irrigation channels were clear. She staked the tomatoes with a neatness that embarrassed me when I looked at what I'd done the year before. She came each morning, left each afternoon. We did not talk much, not out of unfriendliness. It was more that we were both people who had learned that silence was a country you could live in, and that not all company required words. Sometimes I'd be working the pasture fence, and she'd come out to bring water, and she'd stand a minute looking at the hills before going back in. And I understood that she needed that, the looking, and I didn't interrupt it. She was not a soft woman. She was not soft in the way the word gets used about women who need protecting. She was harder than most men I knew, in the ways that mattered, decisive, steady, clear about what she thought and unafraid to say it once. When she thought I'd put too much weight on the bay mare's off foreleg, she said so. When she found rot in the cellar steps, she told me which boards needed replacing, and said if I didn't get to it before winter, she'd do it herself. She was not performing that hardness. It was just what she was. I want to be honest about what I was during that time. I was not easy company. I'd spent years building a life that was functional but narrow, and I was suspicious of anything that looked like it might widen it, because widening it meant caring about something, and I'd cared about Nora for 11 years, and watched her die at 43 of a fever that 3 weeks earlier had seemed like it would pass, and that had been the end of me caring about things in any serious way. But the farm looked better than it had in years. That was the truth. I noticed it the way you notice a thing you'd stopped noticing, walking across the yard one evening, with the light going gold off the barn and the garden running green and full along the south wall, and thinking, this looks like something. This looks like a place someone lives in, not just works. I did not examine that thought too closely either. It was September when she told me. I was splitting wood and she came around the corner of the barn and stood at a distance that I recognized, that particular distance women choose when they need to say something and are not certain how it will be received. I stopped splitting and leaned on the handle and waited. She was carrying a child. She was sure of it. She was telling me because she thought I deserved to know, and because she wasn't going to hide it and wasn't going to lie to me, and because she would understand if I felt I needed to end the arrangement. I set the axe down on the block and I asked her whose it was. Not to be cruel, I want to make that plain. To understand. It was Hargrove's. The timing was beyond question. It had to have happened in the last weeks before he put her out, and she hadn't known when he divorced her. And by the time she understood what was happening, there was no version of telling him that didn't require her to be in the same room as him and his new wife, asking for something, and she'd made her decision about that. She was not asking me anything. She wanted to make that clear too. She was telling me, not asking. I picked the axe back up and split another piece and stacked it and said, "You can stay." She didn't answer right away. I wasn't looking at her. She said, "I'll earn it." I said, "I know you will. That's not why I'm saying it." She went back inside, and I split wood until my arms ached. She did not move into the house. She kept her room in town through the fall and was at the farm each morning the same as she'd always been. Her condition became visible by November, and then there was the town to contend with, which is to say there was Ruth Pell at the dry goods, who was a good woman in many ways but who treated other people's business as a kind of staple good that she felt entitled to dispense freely. Within 2 weeks there was a version of the story traveling Ridgeton that had several inaccuracies and one implication that made me angry enough that I walked into the dry goods and said one sentence to Ruth Pell about things I had and had not done, and then walked back out. I don't know if it helped. It may have made things worse with the town. But Cecilia heard about it. She heard everything in Ridgeton. You could not prevent it. And the next morning when she came to the farm, she stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at me for a moment and then went to work. And that was the whole conversation, but I understood it. Her room in town was on the second floor. By December the stairs were harder for her, and she said nothing about it, but I could see it in how she moved in the morning when she first arrived, the residual stiffness from climbing down, and one afternoon I asked if she'd be willing to use the room off the kitchen. It had been Nora's sewing room and then a storage room for 3 years, and I'd cleared it out in an afternoon without looking at any of what I was moving. She said she'd think about it. She moved in the following week, on a cold morning when the creek had gone to ice at the edges, and the sky was that particular winter white that doesn't look like sky so much as the end of things. She had 2 bags. I carried both. I put them in the room and she thanked me, and I went back outside and I stood by the barn for a while before I could think of what to do next. We developed a life. There's no more precise word for it. She cooked. I didn't ask her to, and she chose to. I kept the fire in the main room going through the night because she was cold and I was not, and it was not a hardship. We ate at the same table. Sometimes in the evening she'd mend by the fire and I'd work the books or read something. And the room had a quality to it in those hours that I hadn't felt in it since before Nora got sick. A quality of being occupied in the right way, of being a room where living was happening and not just time passing. She talked more as winter deepened. Not about Hargrove, she didn't discuss him, and I didn't ask, and it was not a gap in our conversation so much as a piece of ground we both recognized as off-limits and moved around naturally. She talked about where she was from, a farm in Missouri, a father who died too early, a mother who'd been harder than necessary and softer when she thought no one was looking, 2 brothers she'd lost track of. She'd come west at 22 with a cousin who'd had plans that didn't survive contact with the territory. She'd met Hargrove in Ridgeton and married him in 6 weeks, which was fast, and she knew it, and she didn't speak of it with regret so much as with the level honesty of a woman who looked straight at the choices she'd made, even the ones that had cost her. I talked some, more than I'd talked in years. It came out in pieces, things about Nora, things about the farm in its early years when the work was harder and the satisfaction of it was sharper, things about my father who had been a difficult man I'd spent most of my life measuring myself against. She listened the way she did everything else, directly, without fuss. She did not pretend that what we were to each other was something settled and named. She didn't perform a kind of domesticity as payment for the room. She was herself exactly, and she let me be exactly myself, and we were 2 real people sharing a house through a hard season, and that was enough. It was more than enough. I didn't understand yet how much more. January was cold enough to crack the water barrel twice. I wrapped extra timber around the well housing and banked the snow against the north wall of the barn and put the cattle in with extra fodder. She was a month from her time, and she moved differently now, slower and with more deliberateness, and sometimes in the evenings she'd shift against the chair back and put a hand against her side and not say anything, and I'd look at the fire and let her have it. There was no doctor in Ridgeton. There was a woman named Frances Bird who had midwifed most of the births in the valley for 20 years and who was 63, and had the hands of someone who knew what they were doing and the patience of someone who no longer needed to prove it. I'd ridden out to speak with her in November, told her the situation plainly, told her I'd come for her when the time came, and that I'd pay whatever she asked. She'd looked at me for a long moment and said she knew who Cecilia Hargrove was and she'd come. She said it in a way that meant she wasn't going to discuss the rate. The night it started, I was asleep in the main room. I'd taken to sleeping there, in the chair by the dying fire, because the room off the kitchen was separated from the barn side of the house only by a thin interior wall, and I couldn't sleep soundly with a woman that far along on the other side of a wall I couldn't hear through. I'm not sure I could have explained that to anyone. I'm not sure I needed to. She came to the doorway at some point well past midnight, 2 o'clock, maybe closer to 3, and she stood there and said my name once in a voice that was very level, the way she did everything, and I was awake before she'd finished the word. I went for Frances Bird in the dark. The creek road was frozen solid, and the horse knew it and picked his way carefully, and I let him, fighting the urge to push faster. It was one of those winter nights in the territory that has a quality of stillness to it that isn't peace so much as suspension, like the world is holding its breath, and the only sounds are the horse's hooves and your own blood in your ears. Frances Bird opened the door before I knocked. I do not know how she knew. She had her coat on. We rode back together, Frances on her own horse, and the eastern hills were just beginning to separate from the sky, that first dark gray that isn't light yet but is the beginning of the possibility of light, when we reached the farm. What happened then is not something I will go into with any particularity. Not out of discomfort, but because it belonged to the two of them, to Cecilia and to Frances, and my part in it was mostly to stay out of the way and to keep the fire up and to go out to the barn when I felt useless and come back in when I felt I could stand to be in the house again. I paced the length of the barn 3 times. I found myself standing at the workbench holding a piece of tack I'd had no reason to pick up. I went back inside. Frances Bird came to the kitchen doorway at first light, and she had a look on her face that I did not immediately read correctly. She said, "There are 2." I said 2. She said 2 boys, both sound. She's tired, but she's all right. I stood in the kitchen for a moment. I became aware that I was holding the edge of the table. I let go of it. Frances said, "You can go in." The room off the kitchen had the early light coming in through the single window, that clear, cold, exact light that comes at dawn in winter and makes everything look like it was made carefully. She was in the bed, pale, hair dark against the pillow. There was one child wrapped at her right side and one at her left, and she was looking down at them with an expression I had no word for. Still. Like something had arrived that she'd been waiting for a long time, longer than she knew she'd been waiting, and now it was here and she was in no hurry to look away from it. I sat down in the chair beside the bed. I didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say that wouldn't have been smaller than the moment. After a while she looked up at me, and there was something in her face that I want to try to say correctly, because I've thought about it many times since, the exact quality of the way she looked at me in that particular light, in that room, with those 2 new lives between us. It was not the look of a woman asking for something. It was not gratitude, though there was warmth in it. It was more direct than that. It was the look of a woman who had made a decision, who had already made it, maybe some time ago, and was now making it plain, who had seen something in me that she'd decided was worth staying for, and was telling me so, not with a speech but with her eyes, which were steadier and more certain than anything else in that cold room. She reached her right hand toward me from under the blanket, not far, just far enough, and I took it. Her fingers were warm. That surprised me. After a night like that, I'd expected cold. She said, "I want to stay, if that's all right with you." I said, "It's all right with me." She nodded once, like that settled it, and looked back down at the 2 boys. They were sleeping with that absolute, uncomplicated sleep that newborns have, the sleep of things that have just come into the world and haven't yet learned anything to be afraid of. I sat there with her hand in mine, and the winter light moving slowly across the floor, and I thought about the 4 years, or 5, or however many it had been, of walking that fence line each morning, not because it needed it, but because I needed to be somewhere specific so I wouldn't think too hard about what was missing. And I thought that I was done with that. Not because something had rescued me, or lifted me up, or given me a speech about what I was worth, but because a real woman with her own wounds and her own will had looked at what I was and decided it was enough, and in deciding that, in choosing it with her eyes open, had made me believe it too. The boys woke up at different times through that first morning. Frances Bird stayed until midday and then rode home. I made coffee and soup. I brought the food in and set it on the chair beside the bed and went back out to tend the cattle, and when I came back in an hour later the soup was gone and Cecilia was asleep. I stood in the doorway of that room for a moment. The morning's light had shifted now, going a little south and pale, the way it does in February, and I looked at her and the 2 boys in the bed, and the room that had been a sewing room and then a storage room and was now something else entirely. I went and got more wood for the fire. I split the pieces small so they'd catch fast. I brought them in and built the fire up in the main room and stoked the one in the kitchen, and then I did the work the farm needed, because the farm always needed it, and that was as it should be. And for the first time in a long time the work felt like it was going somewhere. We named them that evening. I did not expect to be consulted. She asked me anyway. The older one, older by 20 minutes, I said Daniel, which had been my father's name, and was also the name of a man I'd always wanted to do better by than I had. The younger one she named Eli, which she said had been her grandfather's name, and she said it in a way that made clear she'd been thinking about it for a while. Eli and Daniel. She said both names together, and something in her face settled further. Spring came in April late that year. The creek ran fast and brown with snowmelt, and the south pasture came back green, and the kitchen garden, her kitchen garden now, not a job she was hired for, went into the ground in May with a seriousness of purpose that made me understand she was planning a long future in it. I got the board end bat on the east face of the barn that June. She held the lengths while I nailed them and handed up the pail when I needed it, and the boys slept in the shade of the old live oak at the corner of the yard, and the hills were that deep summer green they only get in June before the heat takes them, and I was up on the ladder fitting the last board when I looked down, and she was standing below with her hand above her eyes against the sun, looking up at me, and there was that same expression, the one I'd first seen in the dawn light of the room off the kitchen, the one that had no performance in it at all. She said, "Looks good." I said, "Yeah, it does." I finished the board. I climbed down. We stood for a moment looking at it, the barn with its new face, clean and straight against the hill. I do not know what I was expecting from the years that came after. I had not expected them at all. But they came, each one solid, each one built on what was before, and the farm ran, and the boys grew into the kind of work that makes a man proud to watch, and Cecilia was at the center of it all with that particular steadiness that was just who she was. Not soft, not hard, real. There are mornings now when I still walk the fence line. Not because I need to anymore, the farm doesn't require it, and I don't need the reason to put my boots on. But sometimes in the early gray before the sun's up, I'll walk it anyway, just me and the quiet, and I'll think about the man I was during those years alone, and what he would have made of where he ended up. He wouldn't have believed it, that much I can tell you. He'd gotten so far into the habit of hollowness that he'd mistaken it for the shape of the thing. But she saw something else. A woman who'd been handed the worst word a valley like this had for a woman, who'd been put out with 2 bags and a story that wasn't true, who'd walked a mile and a half up the creek road and knocked on a stranger's porch post and said what she was there for plainly, without apology. That woman looked at what I was and saw something worth staying for. I think about those 2 boys in the winter light. I think about her hand, warm in mine. I think that is the whole of it, that's everything. Dawn was coming up over the ridge when I first held them. February light, pale and exact. And whatever it was I'd been walking toward all those empty years, I was, without having planned it or deserved it, already there.